Hello, my name is Sunil Gupta and I'm a partner at RSM in the UK, and I lead our firm's private healthcare industry team. Welcome to our series of Health Matters videos, where we are looking at some of the current issues impacting the healthcare sector. Today, we're taking a closer look at fraud risk and how this impacts healthcare businesses. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Emily Wood, a fraud risk specialist here at RSM. Thank you very much for joining us today, Emily. It'd be great if you could just get a little bit of background to yourself and your role within the firm.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Neil. In terms of a bit of background, I have over 10 years experience countering fraud and bribery in both the private and public sectors, including criminal investigations within the police, as well as 5 years as a local counter-fraud specialist within the NHS. At RSM, I help organisations understand their fraud risks and develop counter-fraud cultures, helping them improve their internal controls and reduce fraud and bribery risk. My experience in both proactive and investigations really helps me understand not only the fraud and bribery risks within organisations, but also any system weaknesses that might have enabled fraud and bribery to take place. And this then allows the organisation to implement processes or controls to prevent that type of fraud from happening again.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So, why is fraud such an important issue for private healthcare businesses?
So the increasing use of private healthcare by both the public and the NHS provides an increasingly attractive target to fraudsters from both outside and inside organisations. And whilst it's a statutory requirement for all NHS organisations to have a local counter-fraud specialist, that's not the case within private healthcare. However, organisations who are operating or contracting with the NHS or have been brought in by the NHS to support with wait lists, for example, and other services, must work to an NHS standard and be CQC registered. And this includes the requirement to have fraud and bribery prevention methods in place. And every element of private healthcare will have similar fraud and bribery risks to the NHS, as well as some other types of fraud that are specific to private healthcare. And this, along with the introduction of the new corporate criminal offence of failure to prevent fraud later this year, means that private healthcare providers need to prepare for when, not if, fraud and bribery take place on their doorstep.
Okay, great, that's great. And I think it's really useful to understand the context, and in particular some of the regulations that are already in place around this area. So what would you say are some of the specific fraud risks that private healthcare sector businesses should really be mindful of?
So the most common risks we see are types of employee fraud, such as working whilst off sick, false expense claims, payroll frauds, including altering time records or claiming for time that hasn't been worked. There can also be misappropriation of funds, such as diverting funds for personal gain through amending invoice details and misusing company credit cards. Whilst not strictly fraud, bribery can also take place within a private healthcare setting, and this tends to be where employees have accepted payments or gifts in exchange for preferential treatment or awarding contracts or business to specific vendors.
Okay, and I've also heard of types of healthcare coding fraud. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, that's right. So there are risks where private healthcare providers bill insurers for medical services, and this can include upcoding, where the insurer is billed for a more complex or serious and more expensive treatment than those diagnosed or provided to the patient. There's also unbundling, which is similar to upcoding in that it involves improper coding. However, the bill is then fragmented with the aim of increasing the provider's profits. Additionally, unnecessary medical testing or diagnostics can be conducted when they're not required, with the aim of generating increased or enhanced payments.
All right, okay. So what would you see as the key ways that private healthcare businesses can actually protect themselves against some of these fraud areas?
So firstly, we would encourage private healthcare providers to have in place holistic counter-fraud and bribery strategies, including a policy and response plan, which can support the development of an organisation-wide counter-fraud and bribery culture. Secondly, and from that strategy, a schedule of targeted proactive work and awareness events can be held, reporting into relevant committees to provide updates on how the organisation is meeting its strategic fraud goals. And then finally, to support the implementation and embedding of the organisation's counter fraud and bribery strategy and culture, organisations are encouraged to undertake a fraud and bribery risk assessment, where they can not only record their fraud risks but manage them, helping them to allocate resource or commission proactive detection work in those areas that are deemed higher risk. And we increasingly see our clients being challenged by committees where they report nil instances of fraud taking place. And the challenge is often, well, how do you know what you don't know? Which is so true, and it'll always be the case to some extent. However, having a clear and transparent commitment to an agreed counter fraud and bribery strategy and agenda will enable the organisation to demonstrate that it has committed to and invested in the mechanisms and structure in place to seek out any instances of fraud should it be happening.
Okay. So finally, what would you see as the implications for those businesses that don't actually properly address the risk of fraud in their own organisations?
So there are a number of outcomes, the most obvious being a financial loss if fraud were to materialise. With this could be an increased patient risk depending on the fraud risk as well, a temporary loss or reduction in service, and of course reputational damage. And as well as this, companies could be held liable for the corporate offence of failing to prevent bribery if it's found that bribery has taken place and the organisation did not have adequate procedures in place to prevent that bribery from occurring. And this can result in unlimited fines, disbarment from tender frameworks, directors being struck off, and of course reputational damage. The upcoming introduction of the failure to prevent fraud offence as well will mean that this is likely to be applicable to fraud offences in the very near future.
Okay, thank you, Emily, and it's great to get your insight into what I think we all agree is becoming an increasingly important and more complex issue for the sector. I know at RSM we have many years of experience of working on these specific issues with healthcare businesses, so please do not hesitate to contact me or visit our website if you require any further information. Thank you.